Okay, so my name is Shay.
And I'm Letty.
And we are both juniors in college. So in this podcast, we are going to be sharing people's stories of how they were mentally, emotionally abused, physically abused, and sexually abused by other members of Scientology. So if any of these topics might trigger you, please do not listen. So the first story that we have for you guys today is an example of how somebody was mentally, emotionally abused in Scientology. So Scientology uses disconnection and suppressive persons as ways to mentally manipulate members, resulting in them becoming more dependent on Scientology. So this story is about a man named Brian Sheen, and Brian Sheen was torn apart from his daughter because he was declared an enemy of the church, and the only way to prevent this from happening was for him to pay the church hundreds of thousands of dollars and to become a member himself. And if his daughter violated this disconnection order, she would then become a suppressive person herself and would have to disconnect from her Scientologist husband, mother, and friends. Even though the daughter didn't want to disconnect from her father, she was forced to. So Scientology's higher-ups were the ones that made this decision to make Brian Sheen a suppressive person. And this is something that the church does all the time in order to cut their members off from people that have differing opinions of the church. No one within the church is ever really concerned about this because it's very common. And Brian Sheen recently wrote a book about his experience with Scientology ripping his family apart. So that is just his experience with his family being mentally, emotionally manipulated and abused by the church.
Do you know the title of his book?
Okay, so the name of Brian Sheen's new book is called Relentless: Rescuing My Daughter from Scientology, an Illustrated Story. So, yes, he just recently released this story about the horrific acts that ripped his family apart. So yeah, if you guys want to learn more about his story, you can go check out his book that he recently released.
Okay. The second topic would be physical abuse, and someone with experience on this is Jeff Hawkins. He told his story on being physically abused by the leader of the church, David Miscavige, on Leah Remini's TV show. Jeff Hawkins was considered to be the marketing guru, so when he joined the church, he was working closely alongside David Miscavige. He said that he was physically assaulted by Miscavige multiple times. He explains one incident where Miscavige started making fun of him in a room full of people, and when Hawkins asked him to stop, Miscavige started hitting him in the face because he thought that was disrespectful. No one in the room tried to help during or after the fact because they were all too afraid to do anything. When accusations like this one came out, the church denies them and then usually tries to spin it around onto the accuser to make them sound like they are the bad guy.
So in Leah Remini's TV show, it's on Hulu and now I believe on Netflix. She talks to a lot of different people about some of the different stories and experiences that they have been through while they're in Scientology. So that is also something very interesting to watch if you guys want to watch that.
Is she only doing on Scientology, or does she do other?
She only does Scientology. It's called Scientology in the Aftermath, and she actually grew up in the Church of Scientology.
Oh.
So she's a famous actress, but so she actually grew up in the church and left after she experienced some things herself, and so she talks to a lot of different former members that were in the church and just gets their take and some stories that they experienced and stuff. It's very interesting. And then the last story that we're going to be talking about is on the topic of sexual abuse. So a former Scientologist came forward and told her story of how she was sexually abused as a child on many different occasions while being under Scientology's care. So she didn't want her name to be used, so she is referred to as Jane Doe in this story. So the first time Doe was sexually abused was while she was in kindergarten at Clearwater Academy. She said that it happened on multiple occasions and that she and some other young girls were sexually abused by an employee. She did tell adults at the school about this abuse, but no one did anything. And the next time she was sexually abused was when she was 11, and her abuser was the son of a very high-ranking member of the church. And after this, Doe told her spiritual counselor in the Church of Scientology about this assault, and as a result was sentenced to 3 months of physical labor and issued a non-intubulation, I think that's how they call it, order just like an order that Scientology does. And that is an order that warns that she was at risk of losing standing in the church for bringing in the sexual assault. So then at age 14, she was groomed by her Scientology guardian to enter a sexual relationship with her. Yeah, so kind of some crazy stories, and she told multiple people, but despite her telling multiple people about this abuse, no one helped her, and instead she was punished because the church just assumes that the victims had to, quote, invite the abuse. So after Doe left Scientology, she was stalked, harassed, and followed by the church officials. They also went as far as cutting her brake lines and vandalizing her property. Tactics like these are very common things that Scientology does in hopes to scare former members into keeping quiet. There's lots of examples of this in Leah Remini's TV show. She talks about a lot of people just being harassed after they left.
So is her TV show being threatened by them too? Does she talk about that?
I'm pretty sure it is. So everything that comes out about Scientology, like, they obviously don't want it to come out, especially if it's like, well, bad information in their eyes. You know, it's all true, but they just like to say it's not. So they don't want any information like that or anything coming out have a bad rep on them. And actually they try to keep all of their members like away from any sort of internet and everything because they don't want them finding out about these stories. Yeah, they don't want any of these stories to come out. And I know Leah Remini did have problems with Scientology members and stuff harassing her about the show and following her and when she was filming. And yeah, they basically just try to scare you into not taking any action against them or doing anything because they are doing a lot of illegal things and letting a lot of people do illegal things and just letting it slide. Like, there's been so many cases of physical sexual abuse and they just don't do anything about it. They don't tell police. They just completely let it go. And like they said in this last story, like, they say that the victims must have invited the abuse, so they just make it out to seem like it is the victim's fault when it is definitely not. They try to keep them away from anything outside of Scientology. They only want them talking to other Scientology members.
Are there any like lawsuits that have been won against them, or do they just kind of deal with it?
I don't
on the
know.
side?
I don't know if any of them have been won, but there've been lawsuits, but I don't know like the outcome of the lawsuits or anything. I think this last lady, Jane Doe, that was talking about her sexual abuse, I'm pretty sure that she filed a lawsuit against them, but I didn't see the outcome of it or anything. I'm not sure if it's available to the public, especially considering she didn't even want her name out there. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
But so there have been lawsuits and stuff filed. I don't know what the outcome would be, and I'm not sure if there's even enough evidence to like prove any of this because all of like the members are just saying that this didn't happen and saying that she's a liar and everything. I believe she's in her 20s because she just left Scientology in 2018. This
Okay.
Jane Doe did. Yeah, so I'm sure there's like no actual like evidence of any of this stuff happening because it happened a while ago, so I'm not sure if they could even do anything about it. Leah Remini's show really goes into depth about a lot of these people's stories. We just kind of wanted to quickly touch on a few of these stories just so that we could get some of people's experiences out there. We don't know everything there is to know about Scientology. I don't think anybody ever could because there's so much information. So these are just a few quick little stories. We hope that you guys learned something interesting from this, or at least maybe even learned something.
Okay, so thanks for listening, and go check out our other two podcasts over Scientology. If you haven't listened to those first, we go over the background and abuse factor / religious abuse, what that looks like in Scientology.
Yep, so this is kind of like a part 3 of the podcast. So if you listen to this one first, you might have been confused when we were talking about disconnection and suppressive persons, and they're going to kind of talk about that in the previous podcast to this. So if you're kind of wondering about that, go check that one out. It might make a little more sense.